January 11th, 1938. A man is executed in a Moscow prison. 19 years later, almost to the day, the machine he built launches the first satellite in human history. The world will call it a Soviet triumph. It will not remember his name. Here's the number worth holding on to. 19 years. That's the entire distance between a firing squad in a Moscow courtyard and a beeping metal sphere crossing the night sky over 6 continents, cheered by a planet that has no idea whose work made it possible. Remember that gap. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how it was built and exactly who was erased to protect the story the Soviet Union wanted the world to believe. There's also a document, sealed, signed under conditions that make the signature meaningless and the consequences permanent anyway. It stays locked in an archive for 50 years. Hold on to that too. It resurfaces at the end of this story, and when it does, it changes what you think you just watched. Moscow, 1933. A converted warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, cold enough in winter that breath shows indoors. Inside, 2 men are quietly running the largest rocket research group on the planet, and almost nobody beyond these walls knows the group exists. Georgy Langemak is the scientist, mid-30s, wireframe glasses, the kind of engineer who looks at a combustion chamber and can tell you why it's about to fail before it fails. He understands propellant chemistry the way other men understand a native language, instinctively, completely. Years ahead of formal theory that hasn't caught up to what he already knows from instinct and iteration. Here's what that instinct actually looks like in practice, because it's worth seeing before it's taken from him. Langemak will stop a test mid-sequence over a half-second timing discrepancy other engineers would have waved off as noise. He rewrites his own calculations in front of his team rather than let a small error stand uncorrected, even when correcting himself costs him authority in the room. It's the kind of precision that makes him difficult to work for and impossible to replace. Ivan Klimyanov is the administrator. Early 40s, heavier build, the bearing of a man who has spent his career keeping ambitious, dangerous, expensive projects alive against people in Moscow who'd rather the money went somewhere safer. He's the one who translates Langemak's science into budgets the state will actually approve, who takes the meetings, absorbs the political risk, and keeps the funding flowing when funding is the entire difference between a working engine and a warehouse full of dead metal. Here's the 2 of them together. On an ordinary evening, the kind of moment neither man would have thought worth remembering. Klimyanov comes to find Langemak still at his desk long after the rest of the institute has gone home, correcting the same calculation for the 3rd time that day. He doesn't tell him to stop. He pulls up the other chair and the 2 of them go through it line by line. The administrator following math he technically doesn't need to understand because it's Langemak's. And because at this point in 1935, the 2 of them trust each other with everything the Institute is. That trust is the entire reason RNII works. It's also, within 3 years, the exact thing the state will use to destroy them both. Because men this connected are easy to name in the same breath, on the same charge sheet, in the same file. Between them, they are doing something no government on Earth has managed yet. Liquid fuel rocketry, controlled, throttleable, genuinely modern rocket engines, not the crude solid fuel devices that have existed for centuries, is turning inside this one building from a fantasy scrolled in notebooks into hardware that ignites, burns, and flies. Not far yet, not reliably yet, but it flies. Years before anyone in Berlin or Washington has anything comparable running on a test stand. Their institute has a name, RNNI, the Reactive Scientific Research Institute. Under Langemak and Klimyanov, it becomes the single most advanced rocketry program on the planet, full stop, not for its era. They recruit aggressively. Among the young men who join is a driven, difficult engineer named Sergei Korolev, a name that means nothing to the world in 1933 and everything to it 27 years later. Korolev works under Langemak directly for a stretch, absorbing propellant theory from the one man alive who understands it better than he does. By 1936, RNNI's engineers are solving problems, cooling systems, ignition sequencing, early guidance concepts that Western programs won't catch up to for the better part of a decade. This is the actual, documented head start that will one day put a Soviet satellite in orbit before the United States manages the same feat. Everything that happens in the rest of this story happens to the people who built that head start with their own hands, in a cold warehouse, on a budget they had to fight for every year. None of them know yet what they're building toward. They just know the propellant keeps fouling, the deadlines keep tightening, and the country funding them is entering a period where being right in an argument can get you killed. That period has a name: the Great Purges. By 1936, it has already swept through the Communist Party's own ranks, through the officer corps of the Red Army, through writers and academics who said the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. It has not yet reached the laboratories. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. It doesn't arrive at RNII as an accusation of treason first. It arrives as an argument about chemistry. Inside the institute, there's a real technical dispute, a disagreement over which propellant combination the next generation of engines should be built around. It's not any other year. Somewhere inside the institute, in a meeting, a hallway, a conversation nobody thought was being overheard, someone remembers who argued the loudest. Someone writes it down. November 2nd, 1937. Ivan Klimanov is arrested. The official charge is sabotage, wrecking in the language of the era. There is no wrecking. There is a functioning institute that has, by any honest measure, wildly outperformed every expectation placed on it. None of that matters. The NKVD doesn't need evidence that would survive scrutiny. It needs a confession, and confessions this year aren't obtained through investigation. They're obtained through exhaustion, isolation, and the certain knowledge that resistance only delays the inevitable, for you and for everyone's name you're eventually forced to give up. Picture the actual room, because the story only means something if you don't let yourself look away from it. No windows. A single chair on each side of a bare table. The questioning doesn't happen in one sitting, it happens across days, sessions timed to land at the hours when a mind is weakest, when the difference between an invented crime and a real one stops feeling like it matters because the outcome is the same either way. Klimanov holds out longer than the interrogators expect. It doesn't change anything, it just extends how long it takes before he signs. He breaks. He signs a confession to a crime invented for him, and because a confession in this system is never an ending, only a beginning, he's made to provide names. His signature becomes a list. That list becomes the next wave of arrests. Georgy Langemak is on it. So are others whose names history barely bothered to keep. Engineers who spent years solving problems nobody in the West had even attempted yet, swept into the same net over the same winter, tried under the same fabricated charges, in numbers that turn RNII from a functioning institute into a hollowed-out shell in the space of a few months. This isn't two men caught in something larger than themselves. It's an entire generation of Soviet rocketry's founding talent, gutted at the exact moment its work was starting to matter. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. One of the men whose testimony helps seal Langemak's fate is a colleague, someone who worked beside him, argued propellant chemistry with him across a drafting table for years, respected him, maybe even liked him. Broken in the same rooms by the same methods that broke Klimanov, that colleague gives up Langemak's name to end his own interrogation an hour sooner. This isn't betrayal in the dramatic, villainous sense most stories give you. It's a system engineered so precisely that surviving one more hour costs someone else their life. Nobody in this building is a monster. The building itself is the monster. Langemak is arrested shortly after. He's interrogated across sessions built to produce exhaustion rather than truth. And somewhere in one of those sessions, the man who used to stop a test over half a second of timing error is handed a confession written by someone else, describing a conspiracy that never happened, and told to sign his name to it. The same exacting precision that made him brilliant at his actual work is useless to him here. There's no error to correct, no data to argue with, just a piece of paper and a choice that was never really a choice. Think about what that specific cruelty means for a man like him. His entire identity, everything that made him exceptional, was the refusal to let an inaccuracy stand. Now he's being asked to sign the single largest inaccuracy of his life, and refusing changes nothing except how much longer it takes. He signs a confession to conspiracy, to espionage, to sabotage, the standard charge sheet stamped onto engineer after engineer, scientist after scientist across the entire institute that winter. RNII doesn't lose 2 men to the purge. It loses a significant fraction of its senior technical leadership, gutted in months by a process that has nothing to do with what any of them actually built. Sergei Korolev is swept into the same net, arrested in the same wave, accused under the same fabricated logic. He survives, but barely, and at permanent cost. Years in the Kolyma gold mines, one of the deadliest corners of the entire Gulag system, strip most of the teeth from his jaw, wreck his digestion for the rest of his life, and leave him with a heart condition that will kill him decades before it should. Survival in this system isn't mercy, it's just a slower sentence. The difference between Korolev living and Langemak dying wasn't judgment or evidence or anything resembling justice weighed by a human being who cared about the outcome. It was arbitrary. A stamp landed on one file and not the other. That's the entire mechanism deciding who gets to see the future they're building and who doesn't. January 11, 1938. Georgy Langemak is executed. Not in some abstract, distant sense the record lets you skip past. A man is walked into a courtyard, told to stand in a specific place, and shot, on the authority of a confession signed under conditions designed to refusal pointless. The paperwork afterward takes less time than the interrogation that produced it. A file is closed. A name is checked off a quota sheet somebody in an office upstairs is tracking against a target. Ivan Klimyonov, weeks earlier, the same way, the same courtyard, the same quiet bureaucratic machinery that processed thousands of men that winter with the same paperwork efficiency as approving a budget request. Not for treason, there was no treason to commit, but because the machine needed names, and theirs were convenient, documented, and already extracted under duress by men following a quota handed down from above them. 2 of the most capable engineers in the Soviet Union, the same 2 men who once sat over a desk correcting equations together after everyone else had gone home, are erased from existence in a matter of weeks on the authority of confessions that existed only because refusing to sign them would not have saved them anyway. For 19 years, their names disappear completely. It's worth understanding what that erasure actually cost, year by year, not just as an abstract span of time. Their families live those 19 years carrying an executed man's name in a country where that name is now dangerous to say out loud. Colleagues who survived the purge learn quickly that mentioning Langemak or Klimyonov in the wrong room can reopen a file that's safer left closed. The Institute's own internal records are quietly rewritten to minimize their roles, not as one dramatic act of erasure, but as a slow accumulation of omissions, a name left off a list here, a credit reassigned there, until an entire decade of foundational work has no clear author left to claim it. The institute they built does not disappear with them. It's reorganized, renamed, folded deeper into Soviet weapons development as the country claws through a devastating war and into an uneasy peace. The survivors who remain, the engineers who watched their mentors marched out and understood exactly what happens to people who argue too loudly, carry that lesson forward for a decade. An institute that once thrived on open technical disagreement spends the years after 1938 training itself to avoid exactly the kind of argument that had made it the best in the world. That's a cost no casualty count captures, and it shapes Soviet rocketry long after the purge itself ends. Captured German rocket technology, swept up from the ruins of the collapsed V-2 program, accelerates everything further. A second infusion of expertise stacked on top of what Langemak and Klimyonov had already built from nothing. And the man who survived, Sergei Korolev, still carrying the damage of the camps in his own body, rises to lead exactly what Langemak and Klimyonov started. He becomes, in official Soviet parlance, simply the chief decider. His actual identity is kept secret from the public for his entire career, officially a security precaution in a Cold War where rocket scientists are considered assets worth assassinating, but also, conveniently, a mechanism that keeps the state from ever having to explain exactly whose shoulders this program was built on. Sit with that for a second. The state is hiding the identity of the man who survived. What odds do you think the two men it executed ever had of being remembered at all? October 4, 1957. A modified R-7 rocket lifts off from a launch site in the Kazakh desert and puts a beeping 83-kilogram metal sphere into orbit. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in human history, visible to observers on the ground as a moving point of light crossing the night sky, its radio signal picked up by amateur operators on every inhabited continent within days. The world watches, astonished. Newspapers across the globe run the story for weeks. American officials, blindsided by a leap they assumed was years away, scrambled to explain how they were beaten. The Soviet Union credits a nation, a program, an unnamed chief designer, and basks in a triumph it will milk for the rest of the Cold War. Georgy Langemak's name appears nowhere in any of it. Neither does Ivan Klimyanov's. Not in the international press, not in the official histories the Soviet state prints and reprints for the next 3 decades, histories that credit the program's founding to men who were, by 1957, either dead or too politically careful to correct the record the state had every incentive to keep exactly as convenient as it already was. Picture that room, whoever it was, deciding which names to print and which to leave out. No debate. No hesitation, just a quiet, practical decision about which version of the truth was safer to publish. That decision cost two men the only thing they had after their deaths, the fact of having existed at all in the story of the thing they built. For nearly 2 decades, that's the entire story the world gets. A triumph with one name attached to it, a program that apparently sprang from nowhere in the mid-1950s. No mention of the warehouse in 1933, no mention of the 2 men who spent years solving the problems that made this launch possible before either of them turned 45. It takes until the Soviet Union itself begins to crack open its own past. Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation of Stalin, the slow work of rehabilitation commissions combing back through Purge-era case files years after that, for their names to resurface at all. Decades after their deaths, the executions are formally acknowledged as what they always were, judicial murder, built on confessions extracted under conditions that would never survive honest scrutiny. The charges are declared void, the men are posthumously rehabilitated. It changes nothing for them. It comes decades too late to mean anything except a correction typed into a file almost nobody outside a small circle of historians will ever read. This is what institutions do when survival is on the line. They don't remember who built them, they remember who survived them, who stayed useful, who could still be credited once it was politically safe to do so. Langemak and Klimyanov gave the Soviet Union the technical foundation for the machine that would define the next 50 years of human spaceflight and global military power. That same machine, run by the same state, erased the 2 men most responsible for its existence from its own founding story the moment they stopped being useful and started being inconvenient. Somewhere in an archive that stayed sealed until long after everyone involved was already dead, there's a signature, not Korolev's, 2 other names, the ones that came first, the ones who built the thing before anyone understood it would matter and were never supposed to be found again. They were found. That's the only justice this story gets, and it's worth being honest about how small a justice that actually is. A correction in a file, decades late, for 2 men who never lived to hear it. That's the pattern this channel exists to find. Not the missiles, not the machines, not the dates everyone already knows, the people underneath them. The ones institutions used and then quietly wrote out of their own history the moment it was convenient. Every video here is built the same way. Real sources, no invented quotes, no comfortable version of the past. Subscribe if you want the next one found before it disappears for good, the same way these 2 men almost did.